So everyone, as we're all joining, we'll get started in a few minutes. So get comfy, and if you need to grab a drink of water or anything before we get started, you have a few minutes. Just plugging in my mic. Cool. So I hope everyone is having a good Tuesday. It is. I don't think I mentioned this yesterday. I'm in Toronto right now, and it is really rainy here today. And so I hope it's better in Manitoba or wherever you are joining us from. I will say that one of the very few upsides to COVID and to online teaching is that I'm able to teach different places. So I never normally I could not teach this class because of geography, and I've given a lot of like guest lectures, and I've had a lot of guest speakers in my classes who are able to just kind of like cross borders, and that's so lovely. Good afternoon, Karen. Hi. So as much as it's very difficult and we're all struggling, and I know online learning is really challenging, there are upsides. So I like that. Just give people a few more minutes. I just got an email and I wonder if someone who can't get in. Nope, people are in. That's weird. So I will ask everyone, because I forgot to do this yesterday, just if you can mute your phone. I guess if your mic's off, it doesn't really matter, but for your own paying attentionness, it might be easier to focus on me if your phone is at least muted. And I'm going to mute my other windows. The people count is still steadily going up, so I'm just going to give everyone a few more minutes to file in. Party. So just before we get started, I'm going to ask everyone who's here so far, if you do have any discussion questions that you came up with based on these readings that you would like to share, I'll invite you to put them in the chat. Again, this is not mandatory, and I'm not grading any of these. It just gives me a chance to kind of check in how you're feeling about the reading, and I'll know to kind of emphasize certain things in my talk. It also means we can talk about it as a class after, so I'll just say you can do that right now. Maybe I'll put that in the chat for anyone who comes in the next minute. And also, if you don't want everyone to see your discussion question, you can also send it just to me. And again, not grading it. I will not keep a record. I do not have the capacity to keep these kind of scrupulous records. I silenced you. Good questions, guys. Sorry, I know I'm visibly responding to questions some of you can't see, and I'm just like, these are really good questions, everyone. So I'm going to take a minute. Yes. Yes. What indeed makes people uncomfortable? Oh, I'm excited now. I was pretty excited before, but now it's like official. I'm just writing down the questions that have been uploaded so far. So many, I'm so excited. Oh, yeah. Okay. Such good questions. Oh, we're gonna have fun. Okay, so we'll get started officially now. So I have gotten, about 7 or 8 lovely questions that I think I'm going to be able to touch on in the lecture, but certainly I will check in afterwards and we'll make sure that I touched on them and we can have more chats. Before so I'm going to screen share. I hope this works properly. So before I dive into today's reading and the topic, I do want to just talk about the reading response, which is due on Thursday, which is due every Thursday. So share my screen, PowerPoint. Okay, question. Can everyone see can you see just my PowerPoint or can you see like multiple windows on my computer?
Just the PowerPoint.
Oh, thank you so much. That's fantastic. Great. Okay. We're all learning. Okay. So you're going to be doing reading responses, and the reading responses are designed to be cumulative of work you're already doing. So the reading response is a collection of things you do throughout the week. For example, every day I will ask you to bring 1 to 3 discussion questions to a lecture, which we've just seen people are doing, and that makes me so happy. You are free to share these, but you do not have to share these. But either way, just hang on to them, and so you're kind of collecting a little database of discussion questions every lecture. Also, the beginning of my slideshow will always feature a list of key terms to define. And think of these as Easter eggs for my lectures. I won't always spell them out visually, but they'll always be important terms. I'm not trying to trick you. So there will be something that the lecture should answer. If you get all of them, that's amazing, but try and get as many as you can. And again, hang on to these throughout the week. So throughout the week, you're collecting questions you have, and you're collecting definitions of terms I've given you. And then on Thursday, you will sit down, and in a Word document, you will take 2 of your questions. You'll have some to choose from. Pick your 2 favorites, or pick them at random. I don't care. And then you'll pick one of the definitions from the week, just one, and it can be from any of the lectures of that week. And then you will write a brief summary of any of the readings. So, for this week, you can do the reading we did today. You can do a feminism reading from tomorrow. You can do the media studies reading. Just pick one and write a short summary of a couple of sentences that just kind of give me what you understand as the synopsis. So your submission should look like this. Picture this in a Word document. If you want to copy this template, I am really okay with that. Don't copy the content, but if you want to use this format exactly like this is what it should look like. At the top, you've got a title, you've got your name, you've got a date, and then you'll give your 2 discussion questions. So these are 2 sample discussion questions I came up with. What does it mean that gender is learned? What is the point of studying representations of gender in TV comedies? You'll note that those are not questions from the same day. They're from the same week. Then you will have, you'll pick one of the key terms to define. Here I pick gender roles. So you might have learned after today that gender roles are defined as behavior that reflects cultural traditions and understandings of gender. And that sometimes we call that gender expression. And then you will write a little summary. So I picked tomorrow's reading, which is Bell Hooks's Feminism is for Everyone. And my summary is, in this chapter, Hooks addresses anti-feminist prejudices and general ignorance about the feminist movement. She attempts to convince the reader that feminism is not about hating men and is a benefit to everyone in society. She also outlines the contributions feminist activists have made to human rights. That's pretty much as long as I would want it. Again, I don't need a play-by-play. I just kind of need here are the key ideas, top 3 sentences, 1 or 2 is fine. And that's what it should look like. Any questions about that before we move on?
Yeah, I'm just double checking. So for the discussion questions, should it be based on the reading or from the slide?
From the reading, because you'll kind of do it in preparation for each class.
Okay, and can you pick 2 questions or maybe 3 questions from the same day, or it has to be from the same week? Okay.
It doesn't have to be from different days, but it can. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. I'm gonna go back. Go back very smoothly. Sure. Okay, the last thing, this is a logistical thing, and this is something to kind of keep forward around submitting. So you will upload it to Moodle. The best way to do it is to just type it as a Word document, and Moodle gives you an option to upload a file. If you can do it as a Word document, it makes it easier for me to give you any feedback. That's more important with kind of longer assignments, but the thing about a PDF is I can't write on it, and it just makes for less helpful feedback. And if when you are saving your document, please, 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 if you can make the name of your document your last name and then reading response, because what happens, so you probably only have one document on your computer called reading response 1, and that's fine for you. But then if you upload that and I download that and everyone does that, I now have 45 documents that just say reading response, and it's very confusing for me. So if you can make sure that your name is in the title of your file, it makes it so much easier for me to keep track of, and it saves me time that I can spend talking to you in office hours and emailing you and stuff. Yeah, so, and please do that for all your assignments moving forward. And I think it's a good practice for all. I think all your teachers will appreciate that if you learn that in this class. Okay, let's get cracking. Okay, so this week I told you I would do it. Today, we are looking at at social and medical constructions of gender. You read the Lips article, and we're gonna take you through that today. So some key terms, remember, these are the key terms that I'd like you to look for in my lecture today are binary, gender roles, and double vision. So just take a minute to jot those down. Cool. So I think one reason I picked this text in particular is I think this text does a really good job of just introducing us to the history of the questions around gender and sex. What is the difference between gender and sex? What is the relationship between gender and sex? And then how do we problematize the relationship between gender and sex? I'm going to explain what I mean by problematize. It is a very academic theory word that we use a lot. I think one thing that I really like about the Lips article that I hope translates is that these are conversations. The question of, what's the relationship to sex and gender? What is gender? These are questions that have been going on for quite a while. The conversations around them has changed in the past 120 years. One person asked in their discussion question, which I thought was great, asked kind of about how some of these questions are different in 2021, because this text was written about 10 years ago. And it's funny, and I run into this a lot studying gender. Gender studies texts need to be updated so quickly because conversations around gender still evolve so rapidly. So in the way that, like, if I was teaching a class on Jane Austen and I gave you, an English lit textbook from 10 years ago, that would be pretty contemporary. And most things would still hold true. But with gender, 10 years is actually quite a long time. So it's good to be aware of when the thing we are reading was written. And I will try and point that out when I can. I think it is, I'm not sure if you have access to it actually. It might be on your syllabus, but I'll check. But it's also always good to be aware of the historical location of the thing we're reading about, because it does matter actually quite a bit. So in terms of definitions, very simply put, the way Lipps articulates it, and I agree, is that sex refers to physical, anatomical, and biological characteristics. So sex characteristics are bodily and they're physical, like sexual organs, things like that. Gender is sociocultural. Sociocultural refers to both social construction and cultural construction. Gender is behavioral, and gender is enacted. So where a penis is a physical sex organ, it is a physical body organ associated with an anatomical sex. A gendered behavior or a gendered expression of gender might be high heels for women. It might be, sports for men. And the important distinction, we're just getting started, but as a feminist friend of mine has often said, women are not born with high heels. Women are not, we don't come out of the womb wearing pink or blue. We get wrapped in it almost immediately, but gender is something that happens kind of on top of our physical bodies. So generally speaking, a gender role reflects the fact that there are cultural traditions and understandings of gender that relate to sex, generally speaking. Sometimes this is also called gender expression because it's the way we express our gender, which usually has a kind of form of, like, again, if I wear blue and then that signifies maleness, that's me expressing it. Keep in mind that gender roles don't necessarily always refer to dominant norms. So there are very strict kind of like rules for traditional gender, but people who fall outside of those or who kind of like push back against them are still expressing gender. Generally speaking, as we'll talk about kind of today and throughout the course, there are fairly binary relationships of gender. So the idea that gender is understood to be male or female, one or the other, and there are prescribed rules, and that there's, to a certain degree, Lipps talks about the fact that gender is often understood to have some relationship to the physical, and that there is a relationship between sex and gender. So for example, the kind of cultural trope or norm that women are caretakers or that women are supposed to be more active in child rearing, the fact that women do like carry children and do get pregnant is seen as a cultural link, that it's not arbitrary that link developed. Lipps also talks about the fact that like men are generally often physically larger, that testosterone does tend to does produce muscle, it makes a body larger. And so the cultural association between masculinity and strength doesn't come from nowhere. It does come from certain anatomical realities. And that's true. The issue with that is that while it might be the norm and it might be relatively common, it's not a hard and fast rule. And the way society deals with people that fall outside of those norms can be quite punitive. So what happens when people fall outside these norms? Yes, generally speaking, the average man might be physically predisposed to strength more so than the average woman, but there are many strong athletic women. Not all men express their gender in a way that's congruous with strength or dominance. Not all women naturally gravitate towards an expression of femininity that is about very conventional beauty or media. Some women self-identify as butch, or self-identify as kind of just like not particularly feminine. There are people who express gender in a way that isn't within the binary, so that don't necessarily sit on one or the other side, but very much consciously kind of mix those things in a way that might be quite androgynous. So the image we have here is we have a female bodybuilder who is like physically quite muscular. And how might that person's body affect the way in which she is gendered? I also have a picture of Ross Matthews, who is kind of the first person I think of when I think of like a quite effeminate person. Ross is a guest judge on RuPaul's Drag Race and is physically male and identifies as male and uses male pronouns, but is not particularly masculine. Rose Butch, who's the person in makeup, is a Vancouver-based non-binary drag artist, and they really intentionally blur male and female signifiers in their gender. So they'll wear makeup and they will wear a mustache. They often have body hair glued to their chest. And then the last is Hannah Gatsby, is a popular lesbian comedian who is quite outspoken about her gender identity as a queer woman, and presents as not masculine, but also not traditionally feminine. So like within a queer context, she might be said as being kind of a soft butch. We'll get into that later. But yeah, so these are some things to think about when we think about the consequences of prescribing gender. And when I say problematize gender, I'm talking about the fact that like when people say things like, you know, like there are men and there are women and those are the options, we problematize that, but we kind of like, what's the problem with that line of thinking? What are the consequences of that thinking? We resist it a bit and we're critical of it. So if you hear me use the word problematize, and you want to use that word too, that's kind of what I'm getting at. So a major thrust of this article is to kind of look at the biological relationship between gender and sex and ask, is there one? There's a long history of this kind of work being done. It's still being done. I will pause to say that like, I am not a biologist or a medical doctor. And so my expertise on this is a little limited, maybe beyond what I know about like culture. But I do think it's really important to start with this as a text. And I like the way Lips does put it in really good conversation with culture, because in studying gender, we have to look at sex. We have to look at that relationship. And so much, excuse me, a lot of criticism of gender politics, of queer people, of trans people, of feminism, actually will kind of invoke science in problematic ways. There's the word again. So I think it's good for us to kind of know where that's coming from so we can think critically about that. So one kind of concept that gets bandied around a lot in terms of gender and also sexuality is the question of nature versus nurture. This is a really popular question, and it basically boils down to like, in terms of, let's use sexuality for an example. Are people born gay, or do they learn to be gay? Are they socialized to be gay? Is it a product of environment, or is it their genetics? This question has been used about a bunch of different identities. And I think in the context of right now, certainly the question of gender. So like, are girls born are girls who present as female and born female predisposed to femininity, or is that something that's learned? So the way they put it is, do our bodies predispose us to gender identities and behaviors? And how is gender affected by the way we're raised, our cultures we grew up in, and also our historical locations? Because we'll talk about that a little more later, but the idea that like gender has changed and continues to change generation to generation. So Lips does give us a breakdown of the biological not evolution, but like the way that the human body develops sex characteristics in utero. I'm not going to go into tons of detail here, but what I think is important in their analysis and in their summary is looking at the way that the development of the human body actually creates a pretty fluid picture of the relationship between male and female genders. So the fact that they're initially, most organisms are predisposed to be female, and masculinity or maleness is a kind of a natural variation in that, and that multiple steps along the way, the body will start producing different gender signifiers, or sorry, very sexual characteristics, not gender yet. And because sex is essentially developmental in the early process of biology rather than innate, there is actually room for very natural variation in that. So let's talk briefly about the concept of people who are born or develop in early life in a way in which their sex is not male or female in the binary. So generally we refer to this as intersex. You might have heard a term called hermaphrodite. It's not a term we use anymore. It's kind of a dated term. Intersex generally, one, it is more of an umbrella term to lots of different types. Hermaphrodite tends to be a little more derogatory. It's actually named after a Greek god who had both male and female genitalia. But intersex refers, I think, more to a plurality, and it just has less of a history of being used as a derogatory statement. So we don't use hermaphrodite anymore. We use intersex. There's a long list, when I provided some examples here, of different like physiological conditions, we might call them, that can lead someone to develop a body that is intersexed. Some of these, someone asked in a question if people who are intersex can bear children, can inseminate someone. I think it largely depends on the condition. There are some, if someone has the proper physical anatomy to do so, in terms of a womb, in terms of producing eggs or producing semen. It does, I think it depends case by case. I'm not going to go through each kind of category, but potentially yes. Depending on what is manifested, or what is the kind of manifestation of an intersexed body. I think the thing to know here is that these all occur very naturally in nature. These happen. 1 to 4% of the world's population is self-identifies or has a condition that would, not a condition, but like has a body that would read as intersex. So that might sound like a really small number. Like 1% is not huge on paper, but we consider the population of the world. 4% of the world's population lives in the United States. The United States is a very populous country. So that's a huge, that's actually a huge number of people. 1% of the population, if we took the population of Canada and Australia, it would almost be 1% of the world's population. So the fact that 1 to 4% of the population are intersex, that's a pretty significant amount of people with this identity. So to erase that and to say that like there are two genders, one or two, that's actually quite an omission of like natural human biology. The other thing I'll just say about intersex identities is essentially none of these come with much in the way of like bodily danger. Very often they're pathologized, which means they're kind of seen through a disease model, or it's just seen through kind of like a medical condition model, which is why I kind of corrected myself when I said condition. Most work psychologically and physiologically has found that being intersex does not pose significant health risks. However, what happens very often, again, this is a question someone asked, is if a baby is born and they present as intersex and it's kind of observable, for most of human history, there has been a standard, especially in the West, of the doctor making a decision as to whether that baby will be a boy or a girl. So if the baby falls into a category between or is presenting as not binary, the doctor will decide, might actually, like if there are some conditions in which a woman or like a baby is born with an enlarged clitoris that might kind of blur the lines between what a clitoris and a penis is, a doctor might actually surgically remove the enlarged clitoris to make the baby more female. Or they might just kind of raise the baby in ignorance. That has been shown to be extremely damaging to children, because as children grow up and start to manifest sex differences that don't fit with the gender that they've been assigned, that does send a message. They don't understand what's going on with their bodies, which is extremely traumatic. It also sends a message that their natural self is in violation of what they're supposed to be in the social norms. So that can lead to anything from like suicide. People who are misgendered at birth have a higher rate of like self-harm and substance abuse. So the danger in this sphere, being intersexed is not actually a danger to children, but misgendering children actually has like really profound consequences to children. So if you see this meme, people have sent me this meme on social media. There are two genders, and it's quoted to science. No, you can send them. That's actually not true. It's not accurate. And also, just for fun, I want to point out that science is not a person. So you cannot quote science as if it's like some guy somewhere spouting wisdom, nor is science a book. I would say to this sign, it's like, look, who's your sources? Like, what scientific journalist said that to you? They're not checking their sources. Okay, how are we for time? Oh, we're so fine. The last thing, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I thought it was, I liked that Lips brought it up, is the study of male and female brains. And this is something that has a bit of a history, which I think is really important to know, just to educate ourselves on the history of gender. So one of the reasons, like basically studies of male and female brains have largely been inconclusive. Part of it is that neuroimaging is still really hard to eliminate variations, and things like something as simple as caffeine can actually really skew the readings of neuroimaging. But also, the human brain is very plastic, which means our brains change shape and our lobes develop different sizes based on the experience we're having. So there have been studies to show that like childhood trauma literally changes the shape of your brain. There have been studies that show with limited conclusivity that the lobe that regulates emotional intelligence in adult women, it was a relatively small sample size, but in adult women was larger. The problem is that that wasn't true with children. So just because women's physical brains as adults show some patterns amongst gender, that could still just be proof that gender is a socialized thing, that women's brains are not naturally and inherently better at developing social cues, but because women are socialized, they need to have stronger emotional intelligence, and men are socialized not to have emotional intelligence and are kind of punished for being too sensitive. Their brains don't develop that way. The studying of physiology in that way, it's just not super conclusive, and it doesn't make a great argument either. The other thing I want to point out here is that there's the history of studying male and female brains. The original, this is not kind of from a neutral curiosity, but rather like originally the goal was to prove or find a scientific fact to support women as inferior to men. The studying of women's brains and male brains actually grows out of a movement in the 19th century called eugenics, which is gross. Eugenics was essentially like the use of science to study physiology to kind of prove the superiority of gender and race. So there were lots of eugenic studies on colonized people to try and prove white supremacy had a biological link, that whites were superior in a scientific way. There were studies, as we see here, that tried to like find a reason. It's like, why are men so much better than women? Why are women the inferior sex? I bet there's a reason. And there were actually studies also on things like, why are people poor? Maybe there's a genetic link. Why are there criminals? Maybe there's a genetic link. Lips kind of talks about the fact that like, even though a lot of the studies didn't prove the hypothesis, because the hypothesis is like, I bet women are naturally inferior. And when those findings didn't add up, early scientists continued to try and find a link they couldn't find. One of the reasons eugenics really fell out of favor is because like Hitler loved it, and that's a great way to kill a movement. Hitler really actually did try and apply eugenics to like his particular brand of anti-Semitism and xenophobia. So once Hitler gets on board something, that's a pretty good sign that like the world is no longer interested in that as a pseudoscience. I'll end the kind of the biology section with this quote that comes from Lipps, which I really like. Biology is not destiny. Genes are activated or suppressed by environmental factors. Hormones and brain function are almost certainly influenced by the environments in which boys and girls are raised, their behaviors, and by joint effects of genes and social movements. So I understand from the context of my interpretation of the text, it might sound like I'm really coming down hard on science and really yay socialization. And that's, I think, largely a reaction to maybe some of the prejudices I encounter in these debates. But what Lipps is saying is that the thing about nature and nurture, biology and socialization, is that we can't separate them. Is that both contribute, and they don't kind of contribute. It's not kind of like two opposing influences like whispering in different ears. They overlap in really complicated ways, in a way that we don't yet have the tools to measure independently. So I mean, I'm going to make a large case for the role of socialization and culture, because I think that is really significant. And that's also something that we have a certain amount of utility in controlling. We have much more control over our behaviors than our biology. But this is not about fully discrediting anatomy and physiology. I mean, a lot of trans activists talk about the importance of physical bodies in affirming their gender identities. So to say that gender is kind of arbitrary and cut off completely is not my point. My point is that it's complicated and it's interrelated. To say that girls wear pink and that's natural and they're born that way, that's a little reductive, more than a little. Okay, I'm gonna take a sip of water. I'm just going to check in with my own. No, I'm making more. Okay. So what is gender? That's a good question. So now I want to kind of move on to the social categories of gender. I do have a couple of images up here that I'll just kind of share with the group. A lot of these come from advertising. But when we think of gender, I hope we often think of like images and aesthetics and also behaviors. Advertising is a really popular tool of kind of gender regulation. We'll talk about this more on Thursday. So like I'm always really fascinated with, for example, the way like salon products or like hygiene products are marketed to men versus women. Like the Venus razor blew my mind. There are two razors on the market that have been on the market for a while that are exactly the same. Should have an image of this. One is a female razor called Venus and it's pink. And then one is a male razor called like the Mach 3 and it's gray. And they're the same razor, but the men's razor is gray and it's named after something in like air militariness. I'm not good at that. Whereas a female razor is pink and it's named after a goddess. So the idea that this object is gendered, despite the fact that it's exactly the same, we are kind of told what cultural values and norms are acceptable based on gender. A lot of new parents will kind of talk about the fact that like when their babies aren't necessarily wearing gendered clothing, they look androgynous. They don't kind of look like any gender because like a baby is like a little bald cutie, doesn't have a lot of existing gender signifiers yet. So we put it on them so they look more gender norm. Children's toys, like if you ever want to learn about gender, the way we enforce gender to children, like walk into a toy store, the aisles are so gendered, the color palette is gendered, and children are punished from deviating from that. If I'll get to that in a minute. And then also behavior, like children's activities. Young children are socialized to have gender appropriate activities, like being the only boy in a ballet class is I think still fairly stigmatized, but we'll kind of get there. So gender roles. So children learn gender roles, and gender is actually a pretty important way children are socialized. So for example, by the age of 6 months, a child will actually learn to distinguish between men and female voices. By 9 months, they can kind of spot a picture of a man or woman and say like, that's a woman. It's my baby voice. By the age of 2, they start to understand cultural associations between objects and gender. I thought this was so fascinating. So like by the age of 2, a child will like see a pink ribbon and know that that's a girl's thing. A child might kind of look at like, you know, like a screwdriver and be like, that's for a boy, that's for a daddy. And this actually works more abstractly. So Lips talks about the fact that like a child of 2 will kind of look at a bear or a picture of a bear and understand that that is masculine, even if they've never seen like a man and a bear, like a man hanging out with a bear, but that they understand at that age that masculinity is associated with kind of like strength and roughness and kind of absence of sensitivity, and a bear exemplifies those qualities. So the baby can actually understand gendered objects, like, or also a flower, that like a flower, which doesn't have a gender incidentally, is understood to be a feminine symbol because it's pretty, it's like, it's soft, it's non-utilitary, it's not a tool, it doesn't do a thing, it's there for beauty. I mean, not in nature, but in our culture. So that was really interesting. How do kids pick up these things? How do kids learn this? Does it just happen? So again, sociological research and psychologist research shows that it's not. It's actually a system of rewards, instructions, and punishments. So on the most basic level, children are often rewarded for kind of picking the right thing. Girls will often receive more praise for being kind of clean and put together than a boy will. A boy might actually receive praise for getting dirty while playing, for being like very like mannish, whereas a girl will be punished more harshly usually for getting dirty while playing. I'm not saying a boy will never get punished for getting a sweater dirty, but generally speaking, around gender norms, it's more likely and more common that those two things happen. What else we have? There's also some more abstract learnings about gender. So gender will also be used as a tool for punishment, even if the behavior is a little more abstract. So if a girl is misbehaving, usually being too aggressive, but any misbehaving might be, they might be scolded as being unladylike. And so ladylike becomes this kind of like prized category for just being well-behaved. You know, if a boy is, we've probably all heard the expression, you throw like a girl. That just means you're bad at throwing. That does not mean that like your arm, you know, can like give birth to children, or is like pink. It just is this idea that like, you know, masculinity means being good at sports. You're bad at sports, therefore you're a girl. Girl means bad at sports. So kids very quickly learn. Similarly, men, like young children, male and female, are rewarded for gender appropriate behavior. So kids learn to both avoid punishment and seek praise. I have a lot of, I've heard a lot of kind of adult gay men talk about the experience that their parents would often try, like if they went to a restaurant and a boy wanted a pink milkshake, their parents like wouldn't let them get it because like pink is too girly. Or like if there were cupcake options and one was pink and they reach for the pink one, the parents like wince. And kids do pick up on that. Kids understand the pink things piss off my parents. I'm going to be punished for not picking, you know, the gunmetal gray cupcake or the blue cupcake. So kids pick up on this, and kids often, you know, very often learn to accept rewards, to seek rewards, to avoid punishment. Now, the important thing here, and this is something that Lips underlines, is that gender is not passively received. And so a lot of early sociological theory around gender, like kind of mid to late-ish 20th century, assumed that like, you know, like kids kind of were like neutral gender palettes, and all of this information like boo cupcakes, yay throwing, they just kind of received and were shaped by it like little blobs of clay. More recently, we've kind of learned, psychologicalists have learned that like kids do participate in this. So kids are not passively receiving gender. They do participate. They also seek out these cues. There's a certain amount of pleasure that kids express by behaving in ways that express their gender. There are many young boys who do really like playing sports and who do like highly gendered behavior. Many young girls do like expressing and experimenting with femininity. A lot of queer adults talk about the fact that as children, some of the most fun they had and how they understood themselves as being gay or lesbian or trans was actually experimenting with gender. So like a boy dressing up in his mom's clothes. He might have been punished very harshly for it. The initial experience was literally about play. So gender is something that kids do seek out. And they pick up on the cues as a way to navigate a complicated system. And they certainly don't want to be punished and they want to avoid scrutiny. But to say that kids are little blobs of clay that we mold, again, it's actually a little more complicated than that. What's the patriarchy? Great question, Cameron. So I think the other thing to be aware in looking at these gender roles, and sometimes when we kind of talk about gender as a social construct, we might paint a picture that these constructs are super arbitrary, when in reality, gender norms, especially when they're punitive, are actually about upholding a system called patriarchy. You will hear this word used a lot. You've probably heard it before. Maybe, I don't know. Patriarchy is a social system in which men hold primary power and predominant in roles of political leadership, male authority, social privilege, and the control of property. So patriarchy is a system in which men receive and are socialized to hold more power, and women are socialized to be subservient and supporting. So gender roles very often normalize men to be strong, and to feel entitled to power. Gender roles also are designed to make this seem normal and natural. So when women are punished for behaving in, so men are often, little boys and adult men are often rewarded for being aggressive, being a go-getter, like kind of seeing what you want and taking it. That's a good thing for a male to do. When young women or adult women do that, they're categorized as, the word is often bitches. A woman expressing aggressive, and I'm quoting that, I'm not using that hopefully derogatorily, I'm helping you understand that women are punished for showing aggression or strive or doing something that a man is rewarded to do. And they're also depicted as that as being unnatural. We're often told, and I think like a big theme of this class is looking at that, like, women are rewarded for behaving in very like passive feminine ways, and they're told that that is natural. Women who behave in more like aggressive or butch ways are punished, but they're also punished, they're told that that is unnatural. So a big part of patriarchy is that it like hides the fact that it is a system that's constructed, and it tries to appear as natural as possible. So men are often punished in this system of patriarchy for being weak. So a man is, presented and socialized to be strong and aggressive. And generally men have much more access to privilege in a patriarchal society than women do. But men who deviate from that, men who aren't interested in holding that power, who criticize the power, or who just are not capable of living up to that, are also very much kind of victimized in that system. Socialization, of course, keeps happening after childhood. So it largely does happen a lot for children, and it's in a lot of ways because childhood is so much about education, and the way that many institutions engage with children is pedagogical, is about teaching them. A lot of the gender behavior at childhood is much more overt. But socialization continues into adulthood. So for example, in the workplace, Lips talks about this quite a bit, the fact that like part of the way gender norms are expressed in historically in society is the fact that women, only certain jobs are available to women, and these tend to be organized around gender stereotypes. So women historically have held jobs that are about being supportive and caretaking. So being teachers, being nurses, doing domestic work, receptionists or like secretaries, that is seen as more like natural to a woman's gender expression. Men are socialized to do manual labor and hold positions of authority and power, managers, CEOs, presidents, politicians. Within, and Lips talks about this as social dominance theory, the fact that men are actually socialized to be more dominant and hold more dominant professional career points. This also manifests in the way women are treated in any job. So there was a study done, and I'll find the link if I can, performance reviews where certain words like aggressive and competitive show up in male performance reviews as a positive, but negative performance reviews of women. So being really aggressive and being really competitive for a woman is like something you might want to work on for next week, Susan. But if a man does it, it's like, that's great. We love that. You're gonna get a promotion. Media is a major part of the way we socialize children, adults through all ages. Like one of the functions of media, particularly in Western culture, but really cross-culturally, is to create role models for acceptable and celebrated behavior types. And gender is such a big part of this. This is kind of all we're going to talk about on Thursday, so I won't go too deep. And then also like peers and social groups, even as adults, tend to be very masculine. There still is often a stigma about kind of like blended gender social groups, and especially if you move to a new city and are looking for any kind of like official institutional way to meet people, if you're like joining a group, if you're joining a club, the amount of times that is gendered is really surprising. Like choirs, sports groups, games nights are usually mixed, those are fine. But particularly even the way we think of kind of socializing, and again, media is a large part of this. We think about kind of like, like girls' nights out or like Super Bowl parties. The assumption is that healthy, normal adults typically socialize with people of the same sex, and that those socializations are based around like gendered things. Okay, coming to the close. I think one thing that is important to consider cross-culturally is a lot of the way we understand gender norms tends to happen in a very Western context and doesn't often take history into account. We often hear that like this is the way things have always been, but we don't usually go past the 1950s when we're looking at gender history in a pop culture-y way. The reality is that across time and history, there have been like the norm for most pre-colonial, before colonization cultures is a fairly broad understanding of how gender works. So we have absolutely in most indigenous cultures, in cultures throughout Asia, Southeast Asia, Western Asia, Romanian cultures, pre-Roman Celtic cultures, there are very specific social roles for people who fall outside of a gender binary. They're very often associated with actual spirituality and religion. There's actually quite a few theories as one of the reasons that Christianity takes such an aggressive line towards gender and sexual deviance is that they were targeting pagan religions in a way that kind of like criminalized some of the core aspects of it. Cross-dressing is a huge part of ancient Greek religion, incidentally. Even within a Western tradition, the way that we express and understand gender has changed so much and continues to change. There is a large part of like Western European history in which men wore big fluffy wigs, and that was just super normal sauce. And it was not considered gay or even effeminate. Also through most of the world's cultures before the Renaissance, and kind of depending on where you were, most theaters and performance spaces weren't co-ed. So most were male only. So it was normal for men to play women. In some cases, like in some performance styles, they were like female only. There have been points throughout history in which in like very mainstream straight spaces, women plays males roles in the 19th century. And these did not have the kind of contemporary anxiety that we have around quote unquote cross-dressing as a sign of deviance or queerness or radicalness. These weren't really an attack on the culture. They were just kind of understood. One of my favorite little details about the history of how we understood gender is the term effeminate. So the term effeminate today generally means a man who acts like a woman. A man who behaves in a kind of feminine way, is not super masculine, maybe talks with their hands a lot of like upspeak, maybe has a lisp, usually dresses in kind of a flamboyant way, and is usually almost always associated with homosexuality. So the term effeminate actually goes back several hundred years, but before the 1900s, it had a pretty different meaning. Effeminate before 1900 actually referred to a man who was kind of vain and too interested in women, who was too interested in sex with women, who was not really like very down to earth. So, I mean, these aren't pre-1900 references, but I'm giving you some cultural examples from today. So if we think of a character like Gaston in Beauty and the Beast, or Archer from the cartoon Archer, to a pre-1900 audience, these characters would be described as effeminate. They're so not gay. They're very interested in women, but they're interested in women to the point of distraction. And they are kind of vain in very hyper masculine ways. So even something as kind of regulatory and derogatory as effeminacy, that word has changed significantly in the last 150 years. So the things that we hold true about gender as norms and standards don't go back nearly as far as we're thinking. You know, gender strictness and regulation really kind of like gets bumped up a notch in the 20th century. I'm going to talk about more as we go on, but that does not go back very far. The other thing I want to talk about briefly, and we will talk about this more later, is the way that trans identities work in a binary and also work historically. The visibility of trans politics, identity, and people has kind of exploded in the last decade. And for one, that really troubles a lot of these notions of binariness, because many trans people do not identify as a binary, though some do. The idea of being assigned at birth, the relationship to sex and gender. So, I mean, it's really helpful for us to kind of like study trans people in understanding gender. I also want to hold space for the fact that like trans people receive so much violence and stigma for this. So as much as it's helpful for us to like understand gender by studying trans people, it's also important to understand that trans people are not a metaphor. Trans people are people, and there's been a lot of consequences of the way like patriarchal society has treated trans people. The other thing to note, there was a lot of criticism of not criticism, a lot of transphobia will often make the case that like trans identity and trans language is like new and trendy, and people are just too complicated now, and in the good old days there were men and there were women, and why do we have to make it so complicated? The reality is, again, like historically, gender variation has always existed, but because how violently it was oppressed, we simply did not allow for people to express their genders in authentic ways. Language changes so much around gender now because for so long it had no expression, and people are racing to kind of catch up to find words for experiences that didn't have words before. I was watching Drag Race UK about a month ago, and there was a moment where two queens kind of realized that both identified as non-binary, and they had like a cute little moment. And one of them said to the camera, you know, like the word non-binary is new. The concept of being non-binary is not new. It's just that we did not have a word for it before. And we finally have something that expresses something we felt for so long. And I really loved that because it was so succinct, and it really drew attention to the history there. So in closing, I want to talk about looking at differences in gender very often. And I mean, I'm certainly guilty of this sometimes, is that when we talk about gender, we often look at differences. So certainly in binary genders, a lot of the discourse is like, how are men and women different? Or how are straight people and gay people different? How are trans and straight people different? Trans and cis people different? And Lips talks a little bit about the cost of this, the logic behind it, and kind of an antidote. So part of the good thing about focusing on differences is that can bring attention to the most marginalized people. So if we look at people, if we look at the differences between kind of dominant and oppressed groups, we can actually create more visibility around who is being oppressed in that power dynamic. Focusing on differences can also exclude or promote the quest for superiority. So if we look at the history of you know, the study of the gendered brains, for example, very often this comes from a place of wanting to be superior, of kind of proving superiority. And so that can be a form of violence. The flip side of that is that sometimes focusing on similarities can actually it can bring people together. And we often talk about like inclusivity being really important, especially in liberal politics. The problem is that sometimes focusing on similarities actually erase problems of inequality. So we're going to talk about intersectionality soon. And, you know, some might say it's like, well, why do we have to be divisive in our politics? Like, why do, why do gay people and trans people have to fight? Can't we all just get along? And like, well, the problem is that very often when we say that, what we're saying is, can't the most marginalized people just kind of stop complaining? So that's not great. What I'm getting at here is that there is a reason to focus on differences can be productive, but also divisive. Similarities are important because coalition is very powerful. They can also erase. And what LIPS advocates for is something called double vision, which I think is really important and also is very hard to do because it does mean you're holding space for kind of contradictions. It means that you are going to look at both similarities and differences critically. At understanding, we need to think about them at the same time in conversation. It's way easier just to pick one, to just say like, I'm just gonna look at the differences because that is easier and it doesn't kind of require as much mental energy. But fundamentally, that is much less productive. Yeah, I'm gonna stop there. That's the end of my little lecture. I've been talking for a while, I tend to do. Why don't we take a 7-minute break? If you want to grab a glass of water, if you just want to not stare at your screen. When we come back, I'm going to look at some of the discussion questions you posted, and we might do some group discussion. We might do a breakout room. I'll kind of see how we're feeling. But yeah, come back in 7 minutes. Okay, so we're going to come back. And as people are kind of rejoining us, I'm just going to go over some things people sent me in the chat. I will say, unfortunately, when I'm screen sharing, I can't really see the chat, which is unfortunate, but I will always kind of come back to it after. So thanks for everyone who put stuff. So the first comment I just want to respond to, which I thought was, it's funny because I came very close to including it. Someone asked me what I thought of the genderbread person as kind of a teaching tool or a tool for children. And I'm going to share it because I almost put it on the lecture. That's so funny that you mentioned it. So why don't we just share it? Can everyone see the genderbread person? So again, the genderbread person is, essentially a teaching tool, and I think does a really good job of breaking down the differences. I didn't put it on the lecture today, mostly because I wanted to stay relatively close to the text, because it was a kind of our first kind of shot looking at a text together as a class. But I will show it here, and I want to make sure it gets recorded, and it'll be on the slides, because it does kind of break down the difference between gender identity, sex, the expression of gender identity, and then also attraction. Very often I'll get asked very basic questions about just the difference between, sexual identity and gender identity, which we'll talk about more in the third week. But I think this is a great little graph for just kind of talking about how all these things work together. And I think the added cleverness is that a gingerbread man has no gender. I've never seen a gingerbread man with genitalia. I'm sure it exists, but generally speaking, when I go to a bakery, they're not anatomically correct. And so I think it is a great way of showing, especially, children, but like all humans, just a great visual for that. Cool. The other thing someone brought up, which I thought was great, I didn't comment on this. I wish I had added this. Someone asked about the pink tax. Does anyone want to talk about what the pink tax is? You can just raise your hand if you want to. Can you talk about it? So the pink tax is essentially a phenomenon by which products marketed to women are significantly more expensive. And this is true even when, so like one is that like the disproportionate taxation and cost of like feminine hygiene products like tampons, but also different gendered products that are essentially marketed to men and women. So like female razors are almost 100 times as expensive as male razors, even though they are essentially exactly the same tool. Moisturizing products, shampoos, and they'll often they'll kind of talk about like the science behind the like chemistry of like how it's making your face slightly softer is like formulated for a woman, and I'm sure to some degree that is true, but the reality is that like it is so much more expensive to buy products that are coded with women for women, and the reason for that is because like those products tend to be marketed more aggressively towards women, and are told women are told that they kind of like need these to survive. There's actually a certain amount of stigma around men using anything that's coded as like a beauty product. One of the reasons a lot of marketing firms will try and make male moisturizer as like butch as possible, like male moisturizer is like, it's like gunmetal gray, and it's kind of like shaped like a bullet sometimes. Like they're trying to make it as like unfeminine as possible, because men typically don't spend as much on quote unquote beauty products, whereas women are told from a very young age that it's like you need a skincare ritual or you're not a real woman, or that you absolutely need to kind of like augment your quote unquote natural appearance to be more passively female. I might show this video. When will I show this? I should have showed this today. There's a great video. Amy Schumer, who's a problematic figure sometimes, has a music video in which there's like a boy band telling her she doesn't need to wear makeup because she's pretty just the way she is, and she takes off the makeup after the first verse, and then like double down and say like, no, you absolutely need makeup to look like a human woman, which is a fun little clip. Yes, vitamins as well. Vitamins are absolutely often more expensive. Again, like health products in general, and anything kind of in like the wellness sphere tends to be marketed more towards women. The flip side of that, which I think is interesting, is that like because wellness, health, beauty are seen as more kind of feminine things, men are kind of socialized to not worry about safety or health. The idea that like male courage and strength is to not take care of your body, to not to not worry about if you're in pain or sick. And one of the reasons that in the West, men have a shorter lifespan than women is that men typically do not go see doctors as often and are more likely to ignore the symptoms of illness. So men are socialized to ignore their physical health and to see addressing physical ailments as a weakness of their masculinity, and therefore literally don't live as long. They're more likely to have something undiagnosed that could kill them. Yes, like wearing sunscreen. Like, I mean, like, we could look at this like across so many platforms, like binge drinking, that men are kind of socialized to like abuse their bodies because it is a sense of strength. I'm just gonna read out because there's some things. Okay, someone's pointed out the gender red man still kind of promotes a binary, and I can actually see that as well. That it's helpful as a tool for helping people understand the basic kind of building blocks of gender and sexuality as constructs, but still maybe doesn't make a ton of space for non-binary or gender fluid people. There's also a unicorn, which you are most welcome to Google. So what I'd like to do now, we're not gonna go the full 3 hours. Maybe I'll say also that most days, on days where we watch a movie or a TV show, we might use the full 3 hours. But for days we don't have a viewing, I will try and give you as much time as possible to stay on top of your readings, because I realize that there's a lot to read and that your time is finite. So today we won't go the full 3 hours, and that'll be kind of the case. But I do want to give you a chance to talk to each other, because we have such a great attendance. We have 30 people in class today. So I'm gonna, first, what I'm gonna ask you to do is I'm gonna ask you to do a 1-minute paper. Just like take out a piece of paper or a screen. And I want you to type down really quickly, what was the clearest to you from the lecture or the reading, and what was the most confusing or the least clear about the lecture or the reading. And so if you can just kind of jot that down, I'll give you maybe a minute and 30. You're not gonna hand these in, don't worry. So go ahead. Okay, and just kind of like wrap up the last thing you're writing, land the plane, as I like to say. So now what I'm going to do is we're going to use the breakout room function. So I'm just going to like randomly send you all to breakout rooms. It's going to be fine. Groups of 4 or 5, it'll be auto-generated. And I'm just going to ask you if you're comfortable sharing what you wrote. Just kind of talk to each other, say like, this is the thing that I understood the most or the least. And if anyone can kind of speak to something that someone else didn't understand, that's awesome. If you both wrote down the same thing for Clearest, you can also talk about that. Just discuss. And I'll give you about 10 minutes. I'll give you a little warning when I'm going to bring you back. And then we'll just kind of share what you talked about in groups. Okay, here we go. You have been invited to join your room, so you should be able to. Welcome back to the main room. So I would love to hear what you talked about. So if anyone wants to share, it doesn't have to be what you said. You can give me like a summary of the group chat. You can say it aloud. Just raise your hand and I'll call on you, or you can type it. Oh, Karen, I think we can't hear you. Hold on. Working. Oh.
My mic, oh, my mouse is not working.
Okay.
So I guess I can hold my space key. Hi, everybody. We had a really good chat, and we love your class so far, by the way. And we talked a lot about the pink tax and how that's a ripoff. And we all kind of talked about the idea of biology not being the thing that makes the decision on what your gender is going to be expressed as. And then we really thought it was very interesting about intersex, and why does no one ever talk about that? The fact that, yeah, like that many people really, and no one ever discusses it. So yeah, it's kind of yeah, that's about all we talked about.
That's great.
That was good.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, I mean, one thing else, I'll like drop a little teaser for the week we're talking about queer identity. In general, people from kind of like the LGBT umbrella, and I think trans identity maybe intersex identity gets the very shortest end of a stick, is like one of the barriers and one of the reasons that queer people have had so much trouble for decades and centuries mobilizing and forming communities is that like queer subcultures are almost the only subculture that's not genealogically based. It's not kinship based. So most other subcultures, you know, so like if you are a part of like the Jewish community, you might be very marginalized, but you were born almost always into a family in which your parents are also Jewish, and probably grandparents, maybe cousins, and has some form of community built around that. But if you are gay or trans or intersex, you are almost always born to straight cis parents. So you're not raised within a community of that identity. And for much of history, those communities really couldn't form because historically communities are organized around genealogy. So I mean, like, if anyone wants to do a PhD on this, this would be a great topic as to like why intersex in particular has had such a so many barriers just to kind of its proliferation. But that is a great observation, and I also think that's super interesting. Oh, I see someone has written something, so I'm gonna read it. Say, we discussed gender existing on a spectrum versus gender the binary, wishing that the author had further discussed gender in non-Western culture, as it felt a little squeezed in at the end. A few of us also felt that the discussion, sorry, I'm scrolling. A few of us also felt that the discussion on the development of biological sex was a bit lengthy in the article. That's fair. A bit lengthy in the article, only to essentially conclude that it's too complicated to tell us much. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I do think that the discussion around anatomical sex and sex as biology so often doesn't get included in more theoretical conversations around gender identity. And so I definitely wanted to share something that I think delved into that super deep. That said, if you're not super feeling the biology component, like there's not a ton moving forward. So that was kind of our little like check-in with it. I totally hear you about wanting to look more at non-Western forms of gender history, gender identity, and that's definitely something we're going to look at more moving forward. Yeah. Another message. Someone has asked, I wonder if you could elaborate on gender roles specifically, the point you made about how not all gender roles reflect dominant cultural norms. That's a great question. I would be happy to. So very often when we talk about gender roles, we talk about normative gender roles. So the idea that like many women are kind of prescribed into a role as like a caregiver. So the idea that like being a wife and mother is a very kind of typical standard gender role for women. The fact that men are kind of prescribed into a masculine gender role, and that has certain connotations around their like aggression or their like ambition. However, like being a if someone identifies as like a butch gay woman, that is still very much a gender role. It's just a gender role that's not prescribed by the dominant culture, and that person will very likely be, you know, discriminated against or penalized by kind of normative groups. But like that self-identifying as a butch woman is still an expression of someone's gender. There's still like a cultural tradition around it. We are going to talk a bit about butchness, and so it's not to say that people who don't express normative gender identities don't have gender identities. They still very much do, and they can be just as kind of like rich and are just as much about expressing something and kind of moving in the world. But yeah, so that's my one example. Is that helpful? Cool, thanks. Okay, yes. Okay, this is a great question because I love talking about effeminacy. So someone asks, a few of us were wondering why certain terms such as effeminate were used as a more derogatory term now as opposed to pre-1900. So, okay, interesting thing is that it was still derogatory pre-1900, but it was derogatory in a different way, and it was way less aggressive. To say, how am I going to say this in less than an hour? To say that someone was effeminate, like, you know, pre now, was to say to someone like, you're vain and you're way too interested in having sex with women. And now it means, you know, you are, you know, you're gay kind of, or you're very gender and non-normative. And a lot of it has to do with anxiety around queerness and homosexuality. Gay people, I mean, this is jumping ahead 2 weeks, but same-sex attraction exists in all cultures across history. But the contemporary way that we understand homosexuality, the relationship between the fact that like men who have sex with men are also kind of effeminate and women who have sex with women tend to also be masculine. Again, those are stereotypes, not necessarily all is true. But that only really starts to pop up in the late 19th century and doesn't really get cooking until after World War II. So it's quite recent. Another part of that like little piece of the puzzle is what we might call like gay panic. The idea that straight people are taught, if anyone thinks you're gay, that is a social death sentence. And that it's really important for, I mean, to a certain degree, men receive this more aggressively, but it's definitely true of all straight people, that it is in your best interest to make sure no one thinks you're gay and to perform your heterosexuality loudly. That was not as much a thing before. People weren't necessarily super worried about people thinking they were gay. So in the pre-1900s, being too interested in sex for a guy and too interested in your masculine vanity were not great things, because it's like, well, that means you're kind of like not concentrating on your work as much. You're maybe not as like grounded and down to earth about your responsibilities. You're just looking to have sex and you're just looking to kind of like be beautiful. Those aren't great things. But after, you know, once we get into the 20th century, when it becomes so terrifying for people to be associated with gayness, that attitude shifts. And all of a sudden, yeah, if a guy is having sex with lots of women and that's his primary focus, it means he's not gay. And that's the most important thing, apparently. So that shifts. As to why the word changes, I think it has something to do with the stigmatization of male vanity. Because a big part of effeminacy pre-1900 is this idea of being too interested in pleasure and beauty, whether it's the beauty of women or your own physical beauty. And the way it gets expressed in the 20th century and 21st is largely around the stigma that like effeminate gay men are too superficial and are too interested in pretty pink things. The gaze gets directed in a different way. That is my, that's my interpretation. That's a lot. Sorry, I just said so many words. Does that make sense? A little bit. Thanks, Kyle. I will say, I really tried to hold back this week about going too far down like the sexuality rabbit hole, just because I know it's easily the first day. And I'm trying to start with the foundations and the basics. We're going to get into a lot of detail about queerness and like homosexuality and trans identity in week 3, but we're also going to start peppering it in as early as tomorrow. So we are going to kind of like, again, like these threads around like sexuality and like non-Western identity and race do keep coming up. So I'm trying to honor this as an intro level class. But I also understand that like gender is a really complex phenomena, and like someone has to go first in terms of the theories we study, but that's always going to mean that like we're leaving some holes. So thank you. That's a great question. So I really appreciate that. I have another question I'm gonna read. Oh, this is a really good point. So I hope I said this already. The words we use, I'm going to say it often, the words we use are super important. And again, language changes and keeps up to reflect like social realities. There's a line in my text that actually talks about suicide and uses the term commit suicide. Generally speaking, we don't use that term anymore. We use the term like die by suicide because the word commit tends to really minimize the reality of like a lot of mental health conditions. It like emphasizes it as a choice. But so we tend today to say the term died by suicide because it emphasizes the role of mental health in that phenomena. I think that's just something important to flag, that this text, again, not super old, but is dated because that was a very common term. To be aware of that in any text we read, to like look at the language being used and cross-reference it to the year it's from is always really important. Cool. Is there anything else anyone would like to share about what we talked about in your group, either out loud or in the chat? That's okay. Sorry.
I was just wondering if I could ask a question. Now, we didn't really talk about this in my group, but I was just like I had a question from what I was reading yesterday, from the reading yesterday.
Yeah, go for it.
So the Caitlyn Jenner thing, I saw it in the text and everything, and it was actually funny because I had actually always wondered about that exact thing and asked that exact question as well. And I just like it seemed at the time, because I'm on Twitter a lot more than I would like to admit, honestly, but at the time it was like, there were so many claims that she wasn't a woman and all of that. And it's one thing to say she didn't deserve it, that's one thing, but like it almost seemed like people were saying she wasn't a woman, but then it was like, okay, like, but where do trans people fall in that regard then? Like that question was always on my mind. So like I'm glad that it was brought out, and I was just going to ask your opinion about the whole situation there.
Yeah, Caitlyn Jenner is an interesting case study because I think the way Caitlyn's like news story broke, and certainly the way like she kind of framed it, but the way the media framed it, is it was kind of, I think, pitched as like a teaching moment. Caitlyn was kind of there to be a spokesperson, more or less, for trans people and also for the concept of transitioning. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact is that Caitlyn Jenner is a celebrity before was a celebrity before she transitioned, and she transitioned in the public eye. So there have been trans celebrities before. The first person to really kind of be celebrated as a trans celebrity was Christy Jorgensen, who's a trans woman from the 1950s. Big news story about that. We're getting into it in week 3. But I think Caitlyn Jenner really did have the distinction of before having been a celebrity pre-transition. And so I think that labor kind of fell to her, and then kind of unfortunately, she ends up standing in for trans identity in the popular imagination, which is complicated because like a lot of Caitlyn's politics are really counter to a lot of trans issues. I mean, I think in terms of people having a hard time reconciling it, I think it largely does speak to a binary understanding of sex and gender. And the idea that someone has to be one or the other, and that those categories can never cross. I'm not super well versed in Caitlyn Jenner's very personal story, but my understanding is that she does self-identify as someone who was gendered male at birth, self-identifies as a trans woman, and then had gender confirmation surgery to bring her gendered self into alignment with that identity. I know that's a very complicated thing to say in the first week. But I mean, I'll just say it out loud in case it needs to be said, is that like trans women are women, trans women are real women, trans men are men. And I think there's definitely like a thread in media and in like conservative politics that equates cisness with legitimacy. So the idea that like trans women are not cis women, and therefore they're not real women, which is like problematic and invalidating, and trans people exist. You know, like medical science and psychology is finally starting to catch up to these phenomenons that recognize that like there's nothing wrong scientifically, medically, psychologically with a trans person. And this kind of speaks to something we were talking about earlier, but like the phenomenon that are really damaging are when trans people are like not allowed to express the gender identity that is their authentic truth. Like that creates gender dysphoria, and that is incredibly damaging and violent to someone. But the actual expression of a trans identity, again, like occurs very naturally in nature. If we look historically, people expressing different gender identities from the one they were assigned at birth happens cross-culturally. And we don't have a very good history of that for lots of reasons we will get into. So I think a lot of the reaction, again, this happens a lot in a lot of transphobic media, is that when people encounter like a trans person in the public eye, there's kind of this reaction of like, we didn't have that when I was growing up. This is new and I don't like it and it's unnecessary. When the reality is like, no, like trans people have always been around, but the options for them have been very limited and their visibility has been actively suppressed. I'll stop there for today, but again, we will talk about this more. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome. Questions? So I have a question here about the reading. There's a section where the reading talks about a woman who's like a biological woman who's not necessarily womanly, and asks, is that referring to a trans woman? Not necessarily. I mean, like definitely kind of incongruity or someone who doesn't identify with the gender that they're assigned at birth is a form of that. But I also think like that at that point, the author is talking about the fact that like there are women who, you know, who have like female bodies and identify with their female bodies, but don't behave in particularly feminine ways. So someone could, you know, have a sex female body, be totally fine with that, and have zero interest in wearing makeup, want to pursue a career that does not typically kind of fall within a hyper feminine paradigm. And so the fact that like womanliness very often is a list of characteristics that have very little to do with biology. Cool. Awesome sauce. Are there any other, so we've kind of naturally pivoted into what I was going to do next, which is always lovely when it happens. Does anyone have any more kind of just general questions about the reading or the lecture? Maybe we didn't talk about in your groups, but just kind of before we wrap up, is there anything you would like me to kind of speak to or ask questions about or just offer an opinion? Okay, cool. So I think we will wrap for today. So I'll give you the last hour to do the readings. I'm just gonna like share my screen one more time so you can see. So again, for tomorrow, we're looking at feminism. Your two readings are Hooks, which is excerpts from Feminism is for Everyone. Also Bromley, What has Feminism Done for Me Lately? These are both available on Moodle. Everything is now available on Moodle. All your readings are up there, so you can go as far ahead as you want. Tomorrow, we're also going to be looking at our first viewing. Excuse me. Feminists, What Were They Thinking? This is available on Netflix. I'm going to try to have us watch this together on one screen because I really like that experience. And I have been told by my IT person at Brandon that is possible. I'm really suspicious because I feel like Netflix is not going to let me simulcast on Zoom, but I've been told I can do it. So what I'm going to say is we're going to try, but it doesn't work. If you can just kind of have your Netflix ready to go, because what I might do is I might say like, we're all going to press play together. We're going to do a little synchronized thing, and then we'll come back and I'll tell you how long the movie is and we'll come back. So if you can just kind of like, just like have that in your back pocket for tomorrow. And yeah, I think that's everything. Again, thank you for such a great class. I feel this was the first like quote unquote real class because we like talked about stuff, and great participation. And I will see you all tomorrow. And just a reminder, I have office hours every day before class. If you want to pop in and chat, you don't need an appointment, but you can make one. And the link is on your syllabus. All right, I will see you all tomorrow. Bye.
Hey, Cameron, sorry, I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
Could you tell me which episode of Modern Family you're wanting us to look at?
I haven't picked yet. I'm gonna decide tonight. I'm almost positive we're watching The Kiss, but I keep binging it to see if I can find like the perfect gender episode.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's fine. Just wanted to clarify because there's a lot of episodes.
There are, absolutely. Yeah. I'll let you know tomorrow.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool, thanks, Ellen. Okay, bye everyone, I'll see you tomorrow.